When I ran for office, I had said that when you look across the central swath of Berks County, there's these little carve-outs for my district, and I'm doing my best to simply ignore them. Given that the way Berks County is carved up, I think that there are advantages to having 4 members of Congress, but obviously only if they're all paying attention to Berks County, and I've done my best to be in Berks County disproportionate to the percentage of the actual district that it is. I've done 66 visits as of August 31st between teletown halls, my Wyomissing office being open 5 days a week, and a number of company visits here in Berks County. I think I'm demonstrating that I'm a man of my word on that. The other thing that I wanted to do was candidly just sort of submit myself to whatever the issues of the day are for you to ask me, whatever hot potato questions there might be. We had an Iran vote. There were, for me, very legitimate reasons to oppose that deal. If you'll note that I did not come out right away and say I was against the deal or I think become too partisan with it. I think they're based on some of the concessions that we made. I'd be happy to talk about that with you. We have a transportation long-term bill that needs to get done. It still has not been done. I've been critical of the fact that we've yet to cross that bridge. And then the other big issue, I think, is the continuing resolution vote that we're going to have this month, and the fact that there are some Republicans that are threatening to shut down the government if Planned Parenthood is funded. And while I think those videos disgust me, we shouldn't be in the business of shutting down the government on any number of issues. And I think that sets me apart from some other members of Congress. And I also wanted to take this opportunity, since we're 9 months in, and election year is next year, and I think sometimes it's harder to get into an editorial board and speak about issues when it's in the context of a political campaign, because you need equal time. And so given the fact that I've been there and I now have 400 some votes under my belt for you to look at, and given the enormity of the vote that's coming up, coming up on the continuing resolution, as well as the vote that we just took on Iran, which I think ultimately will go down as one of the more significant votes that any member of Congress has ever made, that it was a good time to, again, sort of submit myself to issues that are on your mind and that you consider newsworthy for your readers.
Well, let's start with Iran. One of the arguments that had been made in favor of the deal that had been negotiated is that if it were rejected, the United States would be the only one of the 6 nations rejecting it, and the others would not have had the same type of trade embargo, and therefore the U.S. would not have had the same kind of hammer that it had when all 6 nations were agreed. What would be
the counter argument to that?
No, what would happen? It appears now that the deal is going to go through, but what would the United States have gained by rejecting
Sure,
the
it's a
proposal?
good question. I think for purposes of context, those countries want to move forward with Iran and integrate Iran. They want Iran's purchasing power. They want their economy is extremely important to the future growth of the 5 or 6 countries that had already signed on. So the notion that somehow if we rejected the deal, that somehow we would become isolated, I think is a little bit of a fiction, because we're going to be isolated a little bit anyway when it comes to some of the deals that Iran is going to be entering into with other countries. So first and foremost, that's how I would approach just the general perception of it. Secondly, on the leverage that we have, the financial leverage that we have. So about 50% of the world's transactions still make their way through the American financial system. About 0.1% of all financial transactions in the world involve the Iranian economy. So we still have a lot of leverage. We don't have as much leverage as we had 5, 10, 20 years ago, and I don't pretend to suggest that somehow we have the same outsized leverage that we used to have. But if you look at what the terms of the deal are, we do have, I don't feel that we really exacted any of the leverage that we did have. And because, I think proponents of the deal will say, well, we're not the financial behemoth that we used to be. There are other economies in the world that matter more, and so therefore we either need to get on board with this deal or we're going to be left behind. And I don't agree with that assessment. I think that the extent to which we drive a hard bargain by number one, holding those countries who might enter into a deal with Iran to a higher standard in order to participate in deals with us, I think would have forced Iran to evaluate what concessions they were willing to give and what they weren't willing to give.
Are you talking about an embargo on the United Kingdom?
No, what I'm saying is if you look, and I would use the example of the non-nuclear concessions that we made, the ICBMs, and the lifting of the arms embargo. There were components of that deal that should have never made their way into that deal, and they were sort of ninth inning concessions, if you will. And I feel that some of that is because we were unwilling to push up against the threshold of what those other countries were or were not willing to do from a lifting of the sanctions perspective. Those countries wanted the sanctions lifted for their own immediate national purposes, and in the process I don't feel that anyone was looking at the non-nuclear concessions that were made as seriously as they should have.
But at this point, those concessions have been tentatively agreed upon,
Right.
and you have 5 of the 6 nations that appear to be willing to make those concessions.
Right.
The U.S. standing alone, what power would it have, even that it had 6 months ago, when it was working with those other 5 nations,
Well, the question,
to bring Iran back to the table?
well, the question is whether or not the sanctions as applied to, in other words, are we going to isolate ourselves from the Iranians, and are we going to force other countries to choose sides on that? And I don't feel that that was even really ever seriously entertained, and in doing so, that's when you bring about your leverage. So if it seems to me that the conversation we're having right now is as much about how do you go about maximizing your strength and leverage as it is anything else.
But that would have been an argument to make when the negotiations were still going on.
Sure.
The negotiations have now been completed.
Correct.
How would the United States, standing alone, bring Iran back to the negotiation table in order to get a better deal,
Well,
which is what we kept hearing.
Well,
we want a better deal.
Right.
Okay, so we reject this deal. How do we get Iran back to the table to get that better deal?
Well, and I think that the fact that you already had 5 countries out in front, and the fact that we've already gone to the UN and had those votes prior to Congress even weighing in on it, I think that number one, in all fairness, and this isn't even to be critical, but the administration did that so that our hands were essentially tied. But number two, I don't think that we can go back to the negotiating table and negotiate with Iran given where we are in the process. I think at this point you're looking at several avenues for us to create the best possible conditions out of it. Number one, each individual state has their own ability to keep certain sanctions in place. And number two, what happens with the unfreezing of those assets, and where do you first apply those assets to? We have about $45 billion in judgments against Iran due to terrorist activities with victims. So I think that that's the direction that we'll be heading moving forward. But to specifically answer your question, we are where we are. The deal has occurred. I would go back in time and say that because we were so willing to make a deal, and because we made certain of those non-nuclear concessions that we should have gotten more out of it than the deal that we had, and that leaves aside the issue of enforceability. And I don't know how you can argue that there's enforceability when we don't even know what the inspection and verification process is because of the secret nature of the IAEA, Iran. And Iran continues to play games and
Okay.
continues to make those sorts of...
To the best of my knowledge, we can't go back in time.
Yes, sir.
As much as I would like to go back and see several things happen differently. We can't get Iran back to the negotiation table by rejecting the deal. So why reject it? Why not agree to it, move forward, and do what you are suggesting with the best enforcement that we can and weigh in on the judgments, et cetera, et cetera. What advantage other than political embarrassment to the administration is there to rejecting the deal?
Right, it's a good question. Couple responses. Number one, I think if you look at the concessions that have been made, you either agree that they are acceptable within the context of a deal or not. And if you don't agree with them, then you shouldn't be voting for this deal. I don't believe they should have access to intercontinental ballistic missiles. There's only one reason to have them, and that's a threat to the security of America. Number two, as to the arms embargo, as well as the fact that we're not getting any non-nuclear benefits out of this deal, such as release of hostages, just simply because we don't feel that the administration can go back and negotiate a better deal, doesn't mean I should be for something if I don't agree with the terms and conditions of the deal. And the other reason is because from an inspections process, we don't, I mean, there's been report after report that it will be Iran that provides the testing samples to the IAEA for terms of compliance. And if we're in the business now of negotiating a deal to ensure that we do not have Iran is not a nuclear threshold state, then if we don't even know what the inspections and verification process is, then how can I be for a deal when the enforceability provisions aren't even known to me? So it is an imperfect exercise in analysis given a lot of the variables. And for me, I don't think I should be voting for something when there's too many unknowns that should be known as part of the deal, number one. And number two, some of the concessions that we have made are asymmetrical with some of the benefits that Iran is receiving out of the deal. And I would also add this final point. I believe that any deal should essentially earmark where those unfrozen assets are going. So whether it's 50 billion or 150 billion or somewhere in between, and I think ultimately it is somewhere in between, that money is going to be used for terrorist activity. And so are we making the world a safer place through this deal? The administration's response is yes, because over a 10 to 15 year period, Iran will be able to sort of culturally and governmentally correct its trajectory right now and become a more peaceful nation, and we don't have the threat of a nuclear Iran for the next 10 years, and I would reject some of that contention regardless. But in the meantime, they have more money to exercise more terrorism, and if you look at Yemen, if you look at Jordan, if you look at a lot of the unrest in the Middle East, Iran is going to become that much more of a player and a destabilizing force in the region. So again, I mean, you're I think, very in good faith presenting some of the arguments in favor of the deal, or why would you be against this deal given this set of facts. The flip side of that, though, is what does the deal enable Iran to do over the next 10 years? And some of the things they're going to be able to do, they shouldn't be able to do as a result of this deal, and yet this deal contains certain abilities for them to do that.
From the Iranian standpoint, why should they have to go to these 6 nations in the first place in order to be able to pursue nuclear power, whether it's in terms of generation or weapons?
The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Did Iran sign that?
Well, regardless, if we're gonna create a global environment where we're not going to allow a country, a terrorist-sponsored or state-sponsored terrorist country to have nuclear weapons, then we have to go about making sure that they don't get nuclear weapons, and that was the reason for the economic sanctions.
I understand that, but why should any country have to go through these 6 nations or any other nation in order to pursue the same technology that these nations already have? In fact, the only country
Right.
on the face of the earth to use nuclear weapons is the United States.
Right.
Who are we to say, you can have it, you can have
Right.
it, you can't have it, you can have it?
The world's superpower.
Might makes right?
Well, not entirely, but if we're the leader of the free world and we're on the side of promoting security and stability, and you have a country that's clearly looking to unravel that, then we have to ask the question whether we're going to participate in geopolitical considerations or not. And if you look at the Syrian refugee crisis, one can make, I think, a rather compelling argument that due to our inaction with the aggression in Syria towards his own people, borders don't, a country's behavior and the results of it aren't confined to just the borders of that country. And so I'm not suggesting we go to war. I think that that's the last thing anyone would want to do. I don't want to do that. But at the same point in time, I think to say that, well, who are we? If they didn't sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and they're a sovereign country, if they want to pursue nuclear weapons, who are we to prevent them? I don't agree with that. I think that there would be a world of, there's a lot of harm in this world that could come about as a result of that, and I took a constitutional oath to defend the United States, and I think that they pose a very serious threat, and I think that allowing them access to a nuclear weapon would put our security very much in the way in jeopardy.
What would a deal have to have that you sign?
A couple things. Number one, an inspection and verification process that I felt stood up to muster, and included in that would be a full airing of what their nuclear program has consisted of to date. They won't provide that, and so we're somewhat speculating on where their facilities are. We went from an anytime, anywhere type of criteria or standard to now it's referred to as managed access, and it seems much more of a bureaucratic back and forth negotiation on where and when we should be able to inspect than I would have ever, I think most people would have ever anticipated. And I understand things may work a little bit different than the way they're described if you just use a simple mantra. But to your question, an inspection and verification process which is transparent and enforceable, that would be number one. Number two, tying the unfreezing of those assets to first recompensing those who Iran has, who have judgments against Iran, as well as, and I don't know how you would fashion this, but something in the form of making sure that it's used for domestic purposes. The nominee, whomever it ultimately ends up being, is going to be reflective of the Republican electorate. And the electorate, I think, on the Republican side continues to shift, and I think some of it is attributable to disagreements over how to protest, object, or offer an alternative to the administration. I mean, there's a lot of frustration, and the question is, are you channeling that towards a more direct confrontation, such as you could have with Planned Parenthood and the continuing resolution, Or do you rather take the longer view and say, we can't win on this particular issue at this time, we need to offer a contrast going into 2016, and in the meantime, we're going to make sure that the government continues to remain open, and we're going to deal with the challenges as best we can, as collaboratively as we can, with an administration that we don't agree with on a lot of things. And that latter message is not what a lot of primary voters want to hear right now, right? But when you're going to occupy the executive branch, you're going to need somebody who's not going to just be able to, with a pen and a pad and a magic wand, be an emperor, right? You have to work with Congress in order to get things done. And I'm looking for a presidential candidate who has the experience working with the legislative branch, who's willing to go out there with ideas that will change the long-term, some of the structural challenges that we have fiscally, but then ultimately knows and will be able to identify where those points of compromise are, given their experience and given that we do need to start making important decisions, and we can't just keep deferring them. I mean, the president is sort of not, I think, paying attention to some issues that have become worse under his management of them. And I would look to the regulatory state and spending as the chief among them. I would also say his foreign policy leaves a lot to be desired. But how Republican presidential candidates respond to that, I think many voters are looking for somebody who can characterize their frustration in terms that they most identify with, rather than somebody right now who's offering a long-term plan. I haven't seen Mr. Trump really offer what his plan is for some of the big challenges that we have as a country.
One of the big issues we've seen in the last couple of days has been a social issue with the clerk in Kentucky, Davis, who had gotten quite a bit of support from Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, who actually organized the rally for her. And often it seems that the people who are driving the polls are more focused on social issues than they are on economic or foreign policy or whatever else it may be. Is that to the advantage of the Republican Party or not?
Well, I think in the a couple things, if we could sort of deconstruct it. You can say the same thing on the Democratic side of the aisle, which I think for many younger voters and let's just call them, well, Democratic voters, even independents, if you're against gay marriage, doesn't matter where you stand on anything else. So I mean, I think that those threshold cultural and social questions are on both the left and the right.
And Davis is a Democrat.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But it typically, her position on this aligns, I think, with many social conservatives in the Republican Party. Your question out of that was,
is that going to help or hurt the GOP?
When you get to a general election, it won't help. I mean, look, the court has spoken, right? The constitutional question there is, can an officer of the court serving in a ministerial function exercise discretion over issuing a license when those who are there requesting a license have satisfied all the criteria under the law? I used to be their county recorder of deeds, right? If I don't like you, that doesn't mean I don't have to record your deed or the mortgage. I mean that's really what that comes down to. And I haven't even paid much attention to it beyond that, because I think for many who are opposed to gay marriage, that's Davis, right? Is that her name?
That's her name.
She is representing a policy position that some still agree with, even though the court has ruled to the contrary. And in a Republican primary, those candidates who are going to gravitate to that issue are going to garner some support from those who feel very, very strongly about that issue. You could go back a couple years ago when the court had yet to rule on it, with a candidate who would speak in favor of gay marriage, even though it wasn't the law of the land, and those on the left would gravitate to the person who would say, well, we're going to fight this. And I think even if you looked at Montgomery County last year when they were issuing the licenses without it really being permitted, ultimately became permitted. And those, and they were Democrats who were doing the issuing of that, there was a lot of political support from Democrats because they were willing to take on the law that way. I'm somebody, like, my job is to solve problems, my job is to govern, and I think, if you look at my record, I spend a lot more time on economic growth and issues related to transportation, public education, veterans, because I serve on that committee. I'm speaking about that issue because you asked me about that issue, not because I came here to highlight it.
On the other side of the political divide, we've got Clinton and her infamous email server.
Right.
What'd she do wrong?
She set up an alternative email system that was not properly vetted by the intelligence community, and then went about selectively deleting emails without proper oversight over whether they needed to be kept for purposes of the
Historical record.
law versus not.
When she set this up, was there a requirement that the intelligence community vet her email server?
I think that's going to be a question that will be answered in the affirmative by the courts. She obviously maintains that she did nothing wrong. What I don't understand is she said that, and again, I'm speaking about this because you asked me about it, not because I came in here to blast those running on the Democratic side. But what I don't understand is she said that she really didn't spend much time thinking about her email system. There was so much going on. Well, if she didn't spend that much time thinking about it, then why don't she concoct her own little email system? Why don't you just use a system that was in place that is vetted by the State Department, that does have all the protection, the cybersecurity protections that would be needed? And I think her story, because it continues to evolve, she's going to have her own. She's going to have to answer to the Democratic voters before she even gets to a general election. I think there's a lot of concern over that. And from my perspective, you're dealing with questions of national security and Edward Snowden and breaches through OPM. And I feel that part of the reason that she did that is because she didn't want anybody to see her emails, and there was sort of she sort of wanted to create a political wall because she probably presumed she was going to run for president. But in the process, she could have compromised national security and state secrets, and I think that's a very serious issue.
But the vetted servers were the ones that Snowden compromised.
Right.
By having her own email, Clinton kind of avoided that opportunity for somebody to hijack.
Well, look.
And how does this get into court? You said it's going to ultimately be decided by the courts. How does it get into court?
Well, some of those conservative think tanks are going to court and seeking the release of certain of that information under FOIA. And then in connection with that, once all the emails are known, if some of them were marked confidential, and you know how she said she never knowingly did something confidential or never sent out knowingly, if in fact that turns out to not be true, then I think that there are some legal violations, if I'm not mistaken. Because I'm not on the Committee of Oversight, I only know what I read, and I don't spend as much time on that as I do on some of my other legislative work, because candidly, look, I'm in a competitive seat. People want to see me doing things. They want to see me doing my 66 visits to Berks County. They don't want to see me on spending my time, bashing Hillary Clinton and those running in the Democratic primary. It might be advantageous for me politically within Republican circles, but I think if people feel that that's what I'm spending my time on, then I'm not spending my time on solving problems. But you know, I tried to answer what I identify as the legitimate vulnerabilities from a national security perspective on the decisions that she made.
I wanted to bring up an issue that you did sign on to. Just read this morning that you signed a resolution affirming that human activity contributes to climate change and endorsing action to respond to the threat of Earth's changing climate. We should
Right.
do something. That's not necessarily a very popular idea within the Republican Party. You have some of the Republicans that are running for president, Ted Cruz, saying that climate change doesn't exist. You have Rick Santorum saying there's nothing that we can do about it anyway.
Well, I mean, weather patterns continue to change, and if you look at carbon emissions, clearly, I think, particularly through just cleaner technology, that we need to be as prudent as possible, making sure we're not being careless. I mean, the real question is going to be, like, first off, I think sort of the threshold question for many is, what's my position just from a belief perspective. The real question is going to be when we get onto the policy making side of that, and that's sort of going to be the next step, and that's where the rubber's really going to hit the road. And I haven't come out with any specific policy proposals. I do think if you look at some of what the administration has done, sort of superimposing certain compliance measures on states, which has been deemed to be unconstitutional. And then also, the other thing is, I don't think that we can do something in isolation from the rest of the world. You have developing countries that, frankly, want to do the same thing that our country did for hundreds of years, and we need to reconcile some of that. But you're correct.
But then why sign on to resolution saying that Congress and
the
federal government needs to do something about it, but then you're saying, well, we really shouldn't be telling states what to do. So then how does the federal government make any kind of difference?
Well, I mean, I think signing onto that resolution isn't indicated that we can't just stick our head in the sand and say there isn't a problem and that we should just ignore it. I mean, that's right now that's why I signed onto that resolution. The real question is going to be, from an energy policy as much as anything, what does that look like moving forward? And I still think that if you accept that we are the most innovative country in the world, and that left to its own volition, the private sector will be able to come up with solutions. That's the direction I want to see it head.
You mentioned the VA, which has taken quite a hit recently, including a number of front page stories in our paper. What needs to be done to get rid of the backlog in treating the veterans, into maintaining some of the VA facilities to the condition that they need to be maintained? Certain areas of Walter Reed are literally should be condemned. And how do you do this in an environment where Congress wants to cut spending at every opportunity?
And we did just increase the VA's budget a couple $2 billion for the rest of the year to deal with hepatitis C outbreak. Two main areas would be, number one, their technology is like from the 1980s, and we've asked the VA to tell us what he needs in order to create the platforms so that over the long term it's going to be more user-friendly, there's going to be more transparency from a scheduling perspective, and from when your claim was filed. I would remind you that with the Philly regional office, part of the problem there is a certain rule was issued, or guidance letter, and such that you don't even know when people actually filed a claim. So you don't even know how long it took. And you need to have the technology in place so that you can't have the ability for human manipulation is reduced. And the same can be said from a scheduling perspective. I mean, you shouldn't have to wait on the phone in order to schedule an appointment. You should be able to do it online, and you should be able to have a third party be able to evaluate the efficiency of any particular VA hospital based on technology and a platform which is nationwide. So the first part would be there's going to need to be some capital spending to bring the VA into the 21st century. The second thing is the choice program. Everybody has a choice card. If you can't get the service within 40 miles, you can go to a private facility. That needs to continue to be implemented. And we should be providing veterans choice. Now, most veterans ultimately want to go to a VA facility, but the best way to bring about competition, the best way to increase quality of care is to introduce competition into the marketplace. And that's where I think the choice program needs to be expanded, needs to be fully implemented so that we have that.
And why not integrate all existing private, either
Right.
profit or not for profit hospitals into the system, and, for example, let somebody here in Reading go to Penn State, St. Joe's Penn State,
Right.
or Reading Hospital, or Pottstown Memorial, or wherever they want to go, rather than having to deal with the VA.
Most veterans provide feedback that is very positive towards their VA experience, and obviously VA hospitals have the skill set and experience in dealing with some of those uniquely veteran service-related healthcare conditions and illnesses. And as we continue to learn, some of those conditions aren't identified until much, much later in life. And so I think that the VA system is still extremely important for veterans' health care in the country. And I think sort of essentially getting rid of it and sort of opening it up to every facility anytime may be a step too far, but I do believe that we need to provide more in the way of options and to make sure that the choice program is working effectively. There are reports that some VA facilities in the country or employees do everything to prevent the Choice Act from actually working effectively.
Anything you want to tell us that we didn't ask? Anything you?
I wanted to ask about, you had mentioned just in the beginning about how this continuing resolution that's coming up, how you think it would be bad to hold it up because of Planned Parenthood funding.
Right.
Do you think that's even a possibility at this point? Do you think there's enough votes?
Well, I don't know until I get back there on Wednesday. Some of it I think is going to depend on what votes, how the vote series plays out. I think a majority of the conference will ultimately vote to keep the government funded for the next year. And I will vote to keep the government funded for the next year. And I don't believe we should be in the business of finding reasons to shut down the government. Beyond me disagreeing with it tactically, there are a lot of people who have paid into the system, who are entitled to certain benefits. There are certain programs in place. There are certain parks and services that are provided to Americans, to taxpayers, who have nothing to do with Planned Parenthood and have differing opinions on how the Planned Parenthood issue should play out, that I don't feel should be subject to having the government shut down on that particular issue.
Considering the Hyde Amendment, why defund? Planned Parenthood. Federal dollars can't go to provide abortions anyway, simply because it's an agency that is providing abortions. Is that justification to cut off its funding?
I think that the investigation that's ongoing, and there's 3 committees doing investigations into it, the question is going to be whether they are complying with the law.
Do you think the Hyde Amendment was violated?
No, I think that separate and apart from the Hyde Amendment is the question of what are they doing, what are they doing with that tissue, and are they, I mean, it can get very gruesome very quickly.
I know, it's a question of are they selling body parts, or are they receiving
And
donations for providing the material? It's a fine line.
And I think that
Covering
that's sort of the
expenses, I suppose.
that's the subset of questions that I think, I'm not on the committee of jurisdiction, but I think that no, the answer, there are questions that require answers that this investigation will yield, that is not going to resolve itself by September 30th. And so thus, I think that they should continue with their investigations. I think the majority of Americans haven't paid attention to this issue, let alone seen the videos. And for those, and I'm disgusted by the videos. And for those that feel very strongly about the issue, it is not an issue that is ripe relative to the CR for the next year, and that's, you know.
Are you running for re-election? Have you officially?
I haven't announced it, but I expect that I will.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fun question. You're gonna hear the Pope speak next week. Who are you bringing, and what
What's
are
the
you
lady's
for?
name?
Are you Catholic, or I don't know what your religion
Presbyterian.
is? Okay.
People think I'm Catholic because I'm Ryan Anthony Costello, and I went to Villanova Law School.
She's from.
She's from West Pottsgrove.
Right.
I'll
I'll get it here in a second.
She's 88 years old. I think?
86.
86. There was a story in the Morning Call,
Penn Live.
Penn Live, is that where it was?
Yeah.
That lists all her information.
Okay.
If you want to Google that.
But why bring her?
Oh, she reached out, has been going to Catholic services for decades. And we didn't have that many people reach out and ask for tickets, so we wanted to provide an experience for somebody who is well steeped in the Catholic faith and who indicated that they really wanted to be there. And I think, you know, in some other districts around the country, there's been a lot more interest to go to DC for the speech, and I think the fact that you can go to Philadelphia to experience it may have been some of the reason why we're not getting as much activity. And the other thing is, I think people don't realize that I have a ticket to give away.
As a non-Catholic who had the opportunity to participate in an audience with Paul V, I can tell you it's quite an experience. I never expected it to be what it was, but it was quite interesting.
I don't know what to expect.
And he's spoken a lot about climate change, which is something that you're,
Right.
an issue that you're talking about. So.
Yeah, and I'm going down there Wednesday evening, does he speak on Thursday or Friday? He speaks on
Next week it's on Thursday.
Yeah, he speaks on Thursday.
And
I am dreading.
In New York on Friday and Philly on Saturday and Sunday.
I'm dreading the security.
Me
And
too. I have to go to Philly covering.
Do you? I really am. Now look, it may work out perfectly fine, but I don't go to Eagles games. Like, I don't like the big crowds. I like to be at peace, and I don't think that there's going to be a lot of peace and serenity.
So once in a
I hate
lifetime
standing in
historic
lines,
event,
too.
and you'd rather.
I'm complaining about
I could
stuff,
watch.
right?
I could watch it at home.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll be on the House floor for that one, but
I'm headed to the shore that weekend. I'm gonna take as wide a swath around Philadelphia as I possibly can.
What shore do you go to?
My sister-in-law has a place in Ocean City, New Jersey, and we're going as wide as we possibly can.
Any other issues you can think about for me?
Anything you want to tell us?
Well, the only other area where I would just share a couple thoughts is on college affordability. I have co-sponsored providing more flexibility to the Pell Grant system such that you can use it year-round rather than just the 2 semesters. A lot of folks utilizing Pell Grants are working, and so those summer, enable use of them over the summer, I think, is a good thing. Number 2, I am writing a letter to the Secretary of Education. I have Suzanne Bonavici. She is a Democrat from Oregon who I work with on a number of public education issues to make sure that the option for structuring college debt repayment has some correlation with what one's salary is. And there's some discretion there, and I want to make sure that that discretion remains in place, and so that repayment terms are as fair as possible to those in the workforce. There's some other issues, I think, on the college affordability side that we also need to talk about, but those are 2 issues front and center here and now where I'm working on, and I think we need to make college affordable for those that want to go to college. We can't price them out of the market. And I also think the other thing that's going to happen is on the reauthorization of the Perkins Act, which deals with the technical education side. We need to continue down a path of creating career awareness earlier in the life cycle of the student, so that those who want a mortgage sustainable job but aren't going to college realize that at the age of 20, 21 years old, you can make $50,000, $60,000 being a trucker, working in the natural gas industry, working in logistics, working in certain healthcare occupations, that you can get some of that training while you're still in high school and in trade school, and enter the workforce and not have that college debt, not feel that you have to go to college. And when you're looking at the next generation of Americans, we already have a $19 trillion debt, and I think it's like $55,000 per head. And the last thing we want to do is saddle them with more debt related to their life choices at an early age, if it's not going to lead to the meaningful career that they had in mind when they first went down that path. So.
Anything else? Thank you for coming in. We appreciate it. Don't make yourself a stranger.
I won't make myself a stranger. Be as kind as possible in your stories about me. I certainly appreciate that.
Janine Ferrante is the 86-year-old.
Okay.
Where's she attend church? I knew all this, and then up until that interview, and then after that interview, I didn't.
It doesn't say here. Lifelong Catholic.
We can provide.
St. Gabriel of the Sorrowful Mother Church in Step. St. Gabriel of the Sorrowful Mother Church.
Okay.
We'll follow
I can
up
forward this
a little.
to you.
We'll follow up with a little more information for you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it.